Last night, Senator Carper and I issued a report detailing concerns about the impact on the U.S. education system by China. The report is a result of an 8-month investigation that details our concerns focused on the China Confucius Institutes. Based on our findings, we were here to focus on a couple of issues: transparency and reciprocity. Transparency in how American colleges and universities and K-12 institutions manage Confucius Institutes, which are controlled, funded, and mostly staffed by the Chinese government, and aim to promote Chinese language and culture and Chinese interests on U.S. campuses. Lack of reciprocity in how China does not permit U.S. State Department programming in China. We'll hear more about that today. Our report details how China, known for its one-sided dealings in trade sometimes, uses similar tactics in its unfair treatment of U.S. schools and the State Department in their efforts in China. Let me be clear. I support cultural exchange. I support cultural exchanges with China and other international exchanges more broadly. I'm for engagement, but there must be reciprocity, and there must be appropriate engagement without the Chinese government determining what is said and done on U.S. campuses. And the law must be followed. This is why transparency is so important. U.S. officials have expressed concerns about China's influence through its Confucius Institutes. Recently, FBI's Assistant Director for Counterintelligence testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee that Confucius Institutes are, and I quote, not strictly a cultural institute, and that they're ultimately beholden to the Chinese government, end quote. And the State Department has labeled Confucius Institutes, quote, China's most prominent soft power platform. Higher education groups have also expressed concern. The American Council of Education, the National Association of Scholars, the American Association of University Professors have all recommended that U.S. schools fundamentally change how they manage Confucius Institutes or consider discontinuing them altogether. We know that Confucius Institutes exist as just one part of China's broader long-term strategy, but China has invested significantly in them, giving more than $158 million to U.S. schools since 2006. That's over 12 years, not 1 year, incidentally, as I said yesterday. China has also opened more than 500 Confucius classrooms at U.S. K-12 schools. Expanding the Confucius classroom program is a priority for them. A document obtained by the subcommittee details a plan to expand Confucius classrooms by seeking, and I quote, top-down policy support from the state government, legislative and educational institutions with a particular emphasis on access to the support from school district superintendents and principals, end quote. Over the last 8 months, we interviewed U.S. school officials, teachers, and Confucius Institute instructors. We also reviewed tens of thousands of pages of contracts, emails, financial records, and other internal documents obtained from more than 100 U.S. schools with either active or closed Confucius Institutes. Since our investigation started, more than 10 U.S. schools announced they would be discontinuing their Confucius Institutes. We found that the Chinese funding for Confucius Institutes comes with strings attached, strings that can compromise academic freedom. The Chinese government vets and approves all Chinese directors and teachers, events, research proposals, and speakers at U.S. Confucius Institutes. Chinese teachers at U.S. Confucius Institutes sign contracts with the Chinese government, pledging that they will follow Chinese law and, quote, conscientiously safeguard China's national interests, end quote. Some schools contractually agree that both Chinese and U.S. laws will apply to the Confucius Institutes on U.S. school campuses. Think about that for a second. These are American universities agreeing to comply with Chinese law on their own campuses. This application of Chinese law at U.S. schools results in China's exporting censorship of political debate and prevent discussion of some politically sensitive topics. As such, numerous U.S. school officials told the subcommittee that Confucius Institutes were not the place to discuss topics like the independence of Taiwan or the Tiananmen Square massacre. Simply put, as one U.S. school administrator told us, quote, you know what you're getting when something is funded by the Chinese government, end quote. Investigators from the General Accountability Office also spoke with U.S. school officials who acknowledged that hosting a Confucius Institute could limit events or activities critical of China, and not just at the Confucius Institute, but also elsewhere on campus. We'll hear from Mr. Baer about that today. In response to the growing popularity of Confucius Institutes, the U.S. State Department initiated its own public policy program in China. The Chinese government effectively shut it down. Since 2010, the State Department has provided $5.1 million in grant funding for 29 American Cultural Centers, or ACCs, in China. Through the program, a U.S. school would partner with a Chinese school to set up a cultural center which would enable Chinese students to better understand U.S. culture. The Chinese government stifled the program from the start. 7 of the 29 ACCs never even opened. The ACCs that did open found they needed permission from their Chinese partner schools, sometimes including the local Chinese Communist Party officials, to even hold events. Eventually, the State Department stopped funding the program altogether. Again, we'll hear about that program today. While the State Department is mostly known for its overseas diplomacy efforts, it also has oversight responsibilities right here in the United States. The State Department conducts field site reviews to ensure that foreign nationals who come to the United States on exchange visitor program visas are here for their stated reason. While there are roughly 100 Confucius Institutes, again at colleges and universities in the United States, the State Department has conducted field site reviews at only 2, and the State Department found serious problems at both of those schools. State revoked more than 30 visas for Chinese exchange visitors at Confucius Institutes who were only supposed to be working at the university that sponsored their visa, but were actually teaching at Confucius classrooms at local K-12 schools. State discovered evidence of, quote, fraudulent paperwork and coaching, end quote, that was, quote, a deliberate attempt to deceive investigators. Moreover, State told us that it does not collect visa information specifically related to Confucius Institute, so we don't know how many Confucius Institute teachers there are or where they are. Our investigation also identified failures at the Department of Education that have contributed to a lack of transparency and oversight of schools that take money from foreign governments. Under law, if a U.S. school receives more than $250,000 from a single foreign source in 1 year, it is required to report that data to the Department of Education, which in turn publishes it. Our investigation found that nearly 70% of the schools that should have reported receiving funds for Confucius Institute from China did not. When a school fails to report a foreign gift, the Department of Justice can force a school to comply, but only at the request of the Secretary of Education. The Department of Education has never referred this case, these types of cases, to the Department of Justice, not once. The Department of Education has not issued any guidance since October 2004, over 14 years ago, the same year that China opened its first Confucius Institute. It's time for new guidance. Our investigation found that schools in the United States, from kindergarten to college, have provided a level of access to the Chinese government that the Chinese government refuses to provide to the United States. Again, this brings us back to our 2 key points: transparency and reciprocity. Absent full transparency regarding how Confucius Institutes operate and full reciprocity for U.S. cultural outreach efforts on Chinese campuses, Confucius Institutes should not continue in the United States, in my view.